So, let me start, and then afterwards, in the process, hand over to Galina. Maybe you also want to say something about you, or is it, are you fine? Okay. So, yes, as you can see, the title of today's lecture, and you could find it also in the program, Soviet Ukrainian and Yiddish, Literary Theory of the 1920s, Shaping and Translating Ukrainian Intellectual Heritage. So the topic of the series in general is important for today's lecture in a very specific way, because when we think of formalism, so we, I mean literary scholars, students of literature, first of all, Russian formalism comes to our mind, or we identify, rather, Russian formalism with formalism in general. And this is one of our points of departure, also for the publishing project. Every student of literary Literaturwissenschaft starts his studies from some formalist key texts, such as Shklovsky, Art as a Device, yeah, Viktor Shklovsky's famous article. I think everybody here in the room has read it at some point. Or early articles by Roman Jakobson, or Yuri Tinyanov's famous article on the literary evolution. So this is common knowledge of literary studies in Germany and, in a sense, all over the world. In Germany, we are happy to have two very important volumes that allow us to read those famous and important articles of Russian formalism in the original and in German translation. The two volumes that came out with Fink Publishing House in Munich in 1969 and 1972. Texte der russischen Formalisten, Band 1, Texte zur allgemeinen Literaturtheorie und Theorie der Prosa, edited by Yuri Stritter, famous expert in structuralism, and Volume 2, Texte zur Theorie des Verses und der poetischen Sprache, edited by Wolf-Dieter Stempel. So this is our point of departure, and this is where we would, in a sense, also like to arrive with our project, but in a slightly different sense, because we don't want to understand Ukrainian formalism just like kind of copy of Russian formalism. We want to understand it in a broader sense, and we will explain what we mean by that. And the second point of departure I already mentioned. That is Galina's and Alexander Dmitriev's book on formalism in Ukraine, but also a reader, Galina, together with some colleagues, edited, and which is in the process of being published, a reader under the title Ukrainian Literary Modernism, 1910s to 1930s, a critical reader, which combines three different sorts of texts. On the one hand, scholarly articles, secondly, manifests, and thirdly, poetry. Because many of the theoreticians of literature were at the same time poets, and manifests, because of manifest is one of the most important genres of the period of avant-garde. Programmatic manifests, but also articles. This is a very important point of orientation, but we also don't want to copy this reader which will come out in the US. We want to frame our reader a bit differently. We want to, firstly, we have to translate huge number of articles. Then we want to comment them, and of course we want to frame the whole thing with an introduction, substantial introduction, and ask questions about formalism. Question, for instance, the universalism of formalism. How universal was actually Russian formalism will also be a point of departure, because Russian formalism was read and is read up to today as the universalist approach to literary theory. We want to confront local developments in the region we are taking into account, and ask how local they are in their theoretical approach, and compare them to universal, or read them maybe as universalist theory. Of course, we also want to ask, and this is very important, what actually should be Ukrainian formalism, how we define Ukrainian formalism, and a question that results from that, how can we define and understand the relationship between literary theory written in Ukrainian, written in Russian, or written in Yiddish by authors whose origin or whose field of activity was Ukraine or Galicia. Yeah? So we want to take the today's, or the borders of independent Ukraine of before 2014 as as also point of starting point to think about the question, what actually is Ukrainian. We already applied for funding, and we were looking for a publishing house. And what I present here is the compilation of texts with which we applied. And now I will briefly demonstrate the structure. We applied for funding with Stiftung Humboldt-Universität. So we succeeded. And we decided to get in touch with the publishing house Arco, a publishing house which develops in a very interesting way with a focus on Central Eastern Europe, and also with focus on literary texts, but also theory. And as we like the books published by this publishing house, we decided, and we also succeeded, and the publishing house will hopefully will publish our volume. So this is how it looks like at the moment. It's a bit problematic that we are talking about a German edition in English. Therefore, here everything you can see is German. And everything is very preliminary. Important is the title, in the sense that it's already a result of our reflections and of our readings, because one of the results about which Galina already wrote in her book is that, interestingly, there is a specific focus in Ukrainian literary theory or reactions on Russian formalism a focus on reception and aesthetics of reception and the concept of the reader. And for us, nowadays, it's nothing very, I don't know, it sounds not very exciting, but for a time, it was very new and very innovative. I think when you get the chance to look into these texts, you will see also a certain topicality for our days. So therefore, Literatur als Kommunikation. So far we decided to divide the whole corpus into parts. First part, reactions on Russian formalism. Second part, the specific developments in the Ukrainian field, in Ukrainian literary theory. And the third part, concepts of literary history. Something that from the point of view of universalist formalism would sound local. But the point is that, yes, it is local because it is about developing approaches towards national literary history. But the concepts that are developed, they are much more general and can be applied to other situations as well. And therefore, they are interesting for us. And then I've said first, second, third part. But as you can see, there is a first part and the last part that don't belong to the period of 1920s and 30s. And that is for a specific reason, because Russian formalism and Ukrainian formalism as well, or formalism in Eastern Europe, have one common origin, and that is one of the founding fathers of philology in the late 19th century, Alexander Potyevnya, a philologist from Kharkiv, who was very important for Russian formalists as their point of critique and point of departure. We will say about him a couple of words more in a minute. And you also can see that there is a fifth part, which is dedicated to another literary scholar from Ukraine, from a later period, from the he started in the 1930s, and he grew up, so to say, with Russian formalism. He was in contact and even had some kind of friendship with Roman Jakobson. Dmytro Czyżewski, who already started from the 1930s onwards, started to criticize formalism, but also took a lot of moments of this approach for his own analysis. And in the 1960s, in the context of the new reception of Russian formalism in the US, but also in Germany, he played a quite significant role and published a very important article in the series of the so-called Constant School of Literary Theory, Poetik und Hermeneutik, where he wrote a critical review about Viktor Ehrlich's book about formalism in 1966. So we will come back to him as well. Yeah, so this was the plan when we applied, but then happened something unexpected. And this has to do with the second plan, with the plan of another anthology, namely Ukrainian Berlin texts of the 1920s. There, for this second anthology, we from the very beginning decided to combine texts in different languages and also from different segments of the culture of Ukraine, namely, besides Ukrainian texts, also Yiddish texts and poems and stories, but also texts written in German. And thanks to Julia Kaufmann, who is still master student, but about to finish her master thesis, it came to our mind also in this context to look for literary theory written in Yiddish. So this is something really new. There is practically no research about that. There is a, maybe Julia, you want to just briefly say what we have, because there's only one article on formalism in Yiddish literary theory, written by Leah Martin, who is still teaching Yiddish at Potsdam University. So this was kind of inspiration to look for more. And in the meantime, we found a lot more essays and articles written in Yiddish, which participate in the common discussion in Ukraine, but also in Russia. So discussion about formalism, about the pro and cons of Russian formalism, and also about a Marxist approach towards literature. Yeah, so many different authors, very important authors. Some of them wrote, or most of them wrote in more than one language. So Yiddish was not the only language of their publications. Many of them publicized in Russian, but also in Ukrainian, and some of them in Polish, like the poet and philosopher Deborah Vogel, who wrote her dissertation in Polish. Yeah, so very complex, and some articles were published in 2 languages, and for us it's still the question which language was first and why they translated their articles and so forth. Clear is that Kharkiv, for all these authors, was a very important center, the center of communication for all of them. So I don't know, I'm speaking a bit long. No, leave it, please. Okay, we have too many slides, I think, but just briefly a few words about this founding father of literary theory in general, but also linguistics, Alexander Potiebnia, and 2 of his key concepts, which are the origin of formalism and also of the kind of aesthetics of reception which was developed by Ukrainian theoretics. Not Roman Jakobson, but Potiebnia is the one who coined the notion of poeticity, poetichность. Yeah, so the basic opposition for Russian formalism, as you know, is the differentiation between everyday language and poetical language. So this term became very important in order to conceptualize this dichotomy. But actually it came from Potiebnia, who understood it slightly different, namely as a moment of language in general. language in general, because he differentiated between three dimensions: external form, internal form, and content. And related to this internal form was the concept of poeticity. Maybe I can read, I have it only here in German, and in the Russian original, this quotation. Die Symbolik der Sprache kann als Poetizität bezeichnet werden. Umgekehrt scheint es korrekt, das Vermessen der inneren Form als Poetizität des Wortes zu bezeichnen. Wenn dieser Vergleich stimmt, dann ist die Frage nach der Veränderung der inneren Form des Wortes identisch mit der Frage nach dem Verhältnis der Sprache zur Poesie und zur Prosa, also zur literarischen Form generell. Da die Poesie eine der Künste ist, muss ihr Verhältnis zum Wort die gemeinsamen Aspekte von Sprache und Kunst darauf hinweisen. Um diese Aspekte zu finden, müssen wir diese Momente des Wortes und des Kunstwerks zunächst identifizieren. To make it short, poeticity as a moment of language in general. And in some sense, we can say that Podjebnia's definition of poeticity became also important for not only for Russian formalism in the 1910s to 20s, but also for Jakobson's functional model of language, where poeticity is also one moment, yeah, of language. And this was very important, inspiring moment also for Ukrainian theorists. I skipped this because you will continue on. And related to this concept of internal form is the idea of the reception of a work of art as an open process. Let's read this quotation also in German. Ein und dasselbe künstlerische Werk, ein und dasselbe Bild wirkt auf verschiedene Menschen unterschiedlich und auf einen Menschen zu verschiedenen Zeiten ebenfalls, so wie ein und dasselbe Wort von jedem anders verstanden wird. Es geht hier um eine relative Unbeweglichkeit des Bildes bei der Variabilität des Inhalts. Ja? Also therefore he needs the three moments of language. And of course, as always, Renate Lachmann was one of the first to notice that in this idea we can find a proto-theory of aesthetic reception. Yeah?
Dazu musst du zuerst dein iPhone entsperren. Ich sehe keine App mit der Bezeichnung Aesthetic Reception.
Okay. Maybe I should skip this. This is of course also to this open process of meaning production. Die Kunst ist die Sprache des Künstlers und wie es unmöglich ist, den eigenen Gedanken, this comes from Romanticism, of course, den eigenen Gedanken einem anderen mit Worten zu vermitteln, sondern nur einen eigenen in ihm zu erwecken, so ist es auch unmöglich, ihn in einem Kunstwerk mitzuteilen. Daher entwickelt sich der Inhalt des Letzteren nicht mehr im Künstler, sondern in denen, die es verstehen. Ja, also again, the same idea here developed. And so another reflection upon this Podjebnia's approach already from the 1920s and already from a Ukrainian theoretic of literature, Ahapi Shambrai, who took up and directly referred to Podjebnia. The most important aspect of Podjebnia's work is that he considers a work of literature as a process in which the reader, as well as the writer, is an active participant. The work of literature, appearing as a result of its author's creative efforts, does not remain motionless after it comes into the world. It lives in the consciousness of the reader, its meaning altered in the process of creative perception. In other words, the reader's collaboration with the author consists in the unique interpretations that the reader brings to a work of art, which arise from the particularities of their own ideological position. According to Bedouin, it is from these processual features of a literary work that the elements of form and content emerge. And now I hand over to Galina.
Good evening once again. Thank you, Susie, for your wonderful beginning, and many thanks for your interest, engagement, and basically everything you did for this project. So I'm really grateful. Let me start from the previous quote, just to have this continuation. So as Susanne said, Ukrainian formalism from the very beginning developed, we can basically conceptualize it as one of the main features of Ukrainian formalism as in the direction of reader response theory, and in particular this example in this quote from Ahapi Shamrai, who appeals to Alexander Potebnya, even in the title, Alexander Potebnya and the methodology of the history of Ukrainian, of the history of literature. Basically his main argumentation here is how to marriage and how to find a kind of common ground between the Marxist school of literary criticism and the formalist school of literary criticism. Because for formalists, the main point of departure from which they proceeded was the causality. So it is the social order and the changes of social order that basically find its implementation in literature. And for those who practice more aesthetic approach, it is literature and the inner logic of the development of literary styles and so on and so forth. The formalist concept of literary series, Literaturный ряд, leads to the to emergence of different styles, epochs, and so on and so forth. So that was basically the main. Of course, I'm simplifying to some extent, but that was the main tension of the 1920s. And Ahapi Shamrai's article, 1924, quite early because he wrote it in 1923, suggests Potebnya and appeal to the Potebnya's ideas as a common ground which can marry this approach with that approach by, as Susie said, appealing to the literary work as the process, as the meaning of this literary work changes regarding different styles, different literary epochs, readers, and so on. There are a lot of, this topic is so broad and so many different articles and people were engaged in the discussions and produced different texts. But one of the possible approach how to conceptualize Soviet Ukrainian literary theory of the time is talking about different schools. And one of the center of the development of literary theory at the time, it was Kharkiv University, one of three universities in Imperial Russia in the in the basically early 19th century, so it had its history. And Alexander Beretsky and his theory of reader, Alexander Beretsky, who worked at Kharkiv University at the time, and who had his kruzhok, his circle, and his students who basically contributed to the discussions and to the questions of what is form, what is content, and so on and so forth. So as you can see it on this slide. Why it was also Kharkiv as a very important center of the interwar period of Soviet Ukraine, because from 1919 till 1934, Kharkiv became the capital city of the Soviet Ukraine, and later the capital was transferred back to Kiev. Yeah, another one school within Soviet Ukraine that we can trace and could be conceptualized. It was in Kiev with the main scholar Vladimir Perets. Today we will concentrate on the Kharkiv branch, but just I wanted to highlight. We will come back to probably to some Kiev representatives later if we would have time. So Alexander Beletsky, who already in his article of 1922 published in Russian, it's important to highlight that Alexander Beletsky was born in Kazan, and when he was 12 years old, his family moved to or relocated to Kharkiv. Yeah, Alexander Beletsky taught courses on Old Russian and Ukrainian literature. Also, he taught different seminars on the history of literary theory. He also participated in some seminars aimed at an enlightening of the working classes. So basically, he taught how to read Russian classical literature. And also, Alexander Beletsky has had another seminar devoted to the study of Turgenev. Alexander Beletsky, as probably you can see here and here, he published in Russian and in Ukrainian. So basically, here is another of his articles that we also included in our anthology published in the journal Pluzhanin. That is a more mass-oriented journal led by Serhiy Pilipenko, and it's very important to highlight because, as probably you understand, it's very important where these thoughts were delivered and what groups basically were engaged in this literary struggle. So reader writes literature. As I know, we don't know who translated that precisely article into Ukrainian, but as I know from memoir and correspondence, Alexander Beletsky did not write in Ukrainian. I'm talking about Beletsky and his contribution, to different not field of knowledge, but to different cultural spaces that developed in different languages, but within that same state. Just to highlight the diversity and the interconnectedness at the same time of a lot of processes, even though, as you can, or maybe you know from the history, that at that time, in 1920s, Soviet Ukraine, there was a process of nation building supported or boosted by the implementation of the policy of Korenizatsiya, indigenization, in Ukraine known as Ukrainization. Yeah? It also means that the construction of contemporary narratives about Ukrainian literary theory and history and so on and so forth, quite often we exclude those texts and people that operated within other language. Yeah? Because we, as usual, so it's not because of us, it's just because history and nationalism works like this. So we have to exclude something, construct something, and the most, not simply, but evident logic of it is that Ukrainian formalism is something that was written in Ukrainian language. But the brilliance of this project and historical moment was in the fact that it was multilingual and multicultural, intersecting and developing in different directions. Also, of course, with a different relationship towards the imperial Russian culture. Yeah, so this context is also very important. So Beletsky, in his article «Новейшее течение русской науки о литературе», he distinguished 4 types of readers. I wouldn't comment on all of them. I will just highlight the most important and crucial concept that was later developed by other literary critics. It is the concept of the reader who took up the pen. Such readers, authors most often appear at the end of a great literary and historical epochs. Yeah. So basically, in precisely, it was not Bilecki who talked about such phenomenon, very important for the second half of not the second half, pardon, the first half of the first 30 years of the 19th century as Kotlerevщина. Ivan Kotlяревский is considered the founder of new Ukrainian literature or modern Ukrainian literature, yeah, and he published his first parts of Aeneid. It's better to say somebody published his first part because it was a very tricky and interesting history how these parts of Aeneid were published. It was 1798. So we have the date of the new modern Ukrainian literature, yeah. And then there appeared a lot of authors, basically, who do not represent till nowadays a canon of Ukrainian literature, but still they are very important for understanding of the Ukrainian history and implementation of different ideas. So Kotlerevщина were authors who were epigons in simple words of Ivan Kotlarevsky. There were also, Susie probably will continue, there was Zerov, Mykola Zerov, Ukrainian literary critic, translator and poet, who basically took the concept of Kotlarevщина and structured it within the stylistic history of Ukrainian literature. Of course, it was not only Zerov, and I have to skip the Jeremiah Eisenstock's contribution and, for example, Poetica. So basically, it was one of the projects of the students of Alexander Bilecki. They gathered all the works in Russian and Ukrainian language that considered the problems of poetica. So that's why you see these dates, 1900, 1922. It's указатель литературы, so there is a collection of bibliography, so a bibliographical collection, and one of the compilers was Jeremiah Eisenstock. In the archive of Rgali, I found a very interesting letter of Eisenstock to Osip Brik, where he states that our index is printed only in an extract. Only the most significant is taken. It would be desirable to receive some bibliographic data from you and your circle. In particular, I ask you to inform us about your articles published in various newspapers and magazines. Finally, one more request addressed to the circle, Moscow Linguistic Circle, here he thinks about. We would be very interested in information about the reports read in it, about the collective work, the personal work of its individual members, and finally about the published works. In exchange, information about the work of the Kharkiv Circle of Formalists. Yeah. So it's interesting also and important how they defined that themselves, but at the same time, you can see the word formalism is taken in quotations. Yeah. So because Ukrainian formalism or Kharkiv formalism was not that formalism. Yeah. So that's also important. Yeah. Should we continue with Zerov? Yeah. So I will just, as coming back to this concept of Kotlarevщина and the stylistic periodization of Ukrainian literature here is the crucial work for basically till nowadays for the history, for understanding the history of Ukrainian literature. It's a new Ukrainian literature. Письменство, it's also the word that was common to use at that time. So as you can see it here, basically, in other words, why Zerov? And this is crucial because, as Susie pointed from the very beginning, we used to think about Russian formalism and the device as within the terms of a universality. So Shkovsky stated that we have device that works regardless each national literature or context. Yeah. So, for example, I don't know, montage could be applied as a concept, yeah, or as a structure could be applied to any literature, I don't know, Japanese, Russian, Ukrainian, and so on, yeah. So in this sense, in very simplifying way, but in this sense, this universality of Russian formalism was articulated. What is the problem with Ukrainian literature? Why this universality didn't work? Because of basically imperial history, because Ukrainian language was in the second half of the 19th century was forbidden twice. It was 1863 and 1878, especially important date, 1878, where it was forbidden to publish and circulate anything in Ukrainian language. It means that if you're a writer or I don't know, a poet and you want to publish your work in Ukrainian language, not concerning, I don't know, some humorous stuff that depicting Ukrainians as being Malo-Russians and they're always laughing and so on, yeah, it is forbidden. It was forbidden, yeah. It meant that Zerov conceptualized it as Ukrainian literature was perceived as being backward and I don't know, not so well developed and in a sense of like new styles and so on of the second half of the 19th century because of this precise situation, historical, yeah, and because writers didn't have an ability to publish and the literature was circulating in the form of manuscripts, yeah. It means that when these manuscripts were able to be published, it was late for the like stylistic epochs, and they were a priori out of date. But it means if we will apply the logic of universality to these works, it wouldn't work, yeah? Because you would trace basically the same, but it would not tell you the story behind answering the question why. Why, for example, in the beginning of why, for example, in the beginning of 1920s in Ukrainian literature, very influential was still symbolism, yeah? Because symbolism had to be implemented as a kind of like, you know, part of the epoch of modernity, but it was later developed than, for example, in Russian or French literature, and so on and so forth, yeah? So a little bit, I mean, this lateness, yeah? They're basically using this concept of literature of the reader, and Kotlyarevshina, he basically reanimates a lot of authors who came to literature later. He rethinks and reconstructs the canon at that time of Ukrainian literature, and basically he suggests his concept, not his, but concept of the style of epoch. Which one I touched? Yeah? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. And here probably I will ask Caesar to continue with the concept of style of epoch and a little bit maybe Wolfgang, or we still have 10 minutes here.
Yeah, okay. I'll try my best. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. You have to switch off your mic because now. Thank you. Yeah, wonderful. I mean,
Which one? Oh, it's me off as well.
We have a lot more slides, but let me continue at this point. Maybe just a few words to the Yiddish texts, Yiddish articles or works we integrated. So we have in all parts of the anthology, there will be texts written in Yiddish. Some of them, as for instance, Yitzhak Nusinov, they participate in the very lively discussion about the Marxist approach. And it is very interesting. Galia mentioned the problematics of the imperial context between center and periphery, which in most cases hinders developments at the so-called periphery, but in other situations it enables the continuation of a discussion that is politically forbidden in the center. So, and here in this case, this is a quotation from an article by Nusinov, who wrote or published in Russian as well as in Ukrainian, which is in its argumentation very close to Plekhanov. And when it was published in 1930, in the center, Plekhanov was already an author and a theoretician who was not anymore allowed, or yeah. So this is, and also, the situation we try to capture and to depict is not only multilingual, but using a language happened always in a very specific context, and for a certain, was related to a specific also political intention. Let me come back to this historical approach and to literary history as a device of nation building. This was true and important for Ukrainian scholars as well as for Yiddish scholars, but in this case, they developed national approaches towards literary history in parallel. So, and here I want to briefly mention Zinberg, who is one of the most important and up to this day canonized authors of a history of Jewish literature, which he started as a professor at a Jewish university in Leningrad, started to write in Russian. So the first volumes were written in Russian. Then he stopped because he understood that he would not be able to publish the whole work, and started to write in Yiddish and translate the first 4 volumes. Yeah, so always on these biographical slides, you can see that in nearly all cases, the end of these authors and scholars was tragic. In this case, too. Yeah, maybe I can. He developed a dichotomy of Jewish culture and tried to conceptualize the whole development of Jewish culture and also Jewish literature within this certain framework. Just one quotation: aesthetics was frequently bound up with ethics. And he polemicized quite heavily with a formalist approach. Yeah, so one of these important aspects of the discussion. Aesthetics was frequently bound up with ethics, logical thought and investigation, with intuitive creation. We do not here raise the question whether this association was deliberate. We have before us a real fact and must reckon with it, and anyone familiar with the unique development of Jewish literature will have to admit that it is harder than in the case of any other literature to carry through a strict distinction between literary history and the history of literature. This was not the, so there are other places where he directly confronts formalism and polemicizes with formalism. For us, important is this conceptual approach towards national literary history. And most complex and most interesting for us today, I think, is in this sense Mykola Zerov, the already mentioned author, who in a very complex way, provided different approaches and discussed them in his essay on new Ukrainian literature. And let me briefly focus on this. Serov was not only a literary scholar, but also a very important poet and a representative of the so-called neoclassicism, and also a very important translator of classical antique literature into Ukrainian. And he was also repressed and killed in the 1930s, but up to his death and in prison, he continued translating, in this case, Vergil's Aeneid. And this is, of course, a key text for Ukrainian literature, because in his history of Ukrainian literature, modern Ukrainian literature starts from Kotlarevsky's Aeneida. Yeah. This was the wrong direction. He, referring to previous historians of literature, he compares different approaches towards literary history. First approach, referring to Petrov, is to conceptualize literary history divided into epochs of style. So here from classicism, romanticism, sentimentalism, romanticism, realism, and so forth. Okay, he resumes that it's very difficult to apply because many authors do not fit into this scheme because of the already mentioned reasons, so the imperial context. Second approach that he discusses is a geographical or rather geocultural approach to find for different historical situations the dominant center of the literary development. Yeah? So he sees first stage in Poltava, Kharkiv, moving to Kiev, moving to Petersburg, moving back to Kiev, then to Lviv, or two centers compete with each other and end up also in this Kiev-Lviv representing a dynamic between two centers. As it seems to me, an approach that is very discussable also in our days, yeah, to ask what actually is the most important or one of the most important centers in a certain situation, how centers are connected to each other, and so forth. Then a third approach, also very interesting and very productive, as it seems to me, asking the question how actually a national literature develops, how it can develop in contact, coming in contact with other literatures. So the process which has to do with translating as a first step, and then in the course of the further development, being translated. Yeah? And bringing forward own original works, which then become translated. And this I think is also very innovative for its time. And finally, Serov comes back to this moment of the imperial condition, which is the reason for the very specific and compared maybe to Russian literature or other literatures, rather poor development of Ukrainian literature, because the language as such was prohibited, for several times, and so forth. And no possibility to get in touch as described by this other model as it should have been in order to develop fully develop. Yeah, I'm not sure if we have still time. I already said some words about Dmitry Chizhevsky, the multicultural, and also multilingual literary scholar, who, in our opinion, has to finish and complete the whole conception, because he grew out of formalism. He started with polemicizing with Russian formalism in his articles of the 1930s. For instance, in a very important article on Gogol's overcoat, where he directly polemicized with Boris Eichenbaum's famous article on the same novella by Gogol, where Chizhevsky actually, in a very formalistic way, analyzes the role, the function of one single word in this novella, but he accuses Eichenbaum of analyzing exclusively formal elements without thinking and reflecting upon the ideological moment and also the moment of meaning in the text. And this is what Chizhevsky tries to find out. In the 1960s, when formalism became better known in the Western world and became popular among structuralist literary scholars, Chizhevsky continued to discuss this approach, especially in dialogue, in critical dialogue, with one of the first literary scholars who published a whole monograph on Russian formalism, Viktor Ehrlich in the US. And again, here, Chizhevsky underlined the same problem. So, and came back to his article about Gogol. And also, the last point, why Chizhevsky? Chizhevsky, with his history of Slavic literatures, was back then, and we may say until our days, the only literary historian who tried to discuss Slavic literatures in the European context in a comparative way, and develop a model for not only for Slavic literatures, but also for European literatures in general, the so-called wave-like theory, which we still use in our lectures from time to time, a model that operates with style, with the notion of style epoch, so a model which takes the, in a sense, not independent, but a very specific development of aesthetics as its focus. And what is important in Chizhevsky in using this model always focuses on interrelations and connections and entanglements between European literatures, and tries to take into account specific regional developments without permanently using the dichotomy of center and periphery. He discusses it, but like Serov, but it has to do with political conditions, but it is not taken as a determinator of the aesthetic development in general, and therefore this approach is still important for us today. So hopefully we still have some time for discussion